Titles.
We're ready.
Yeah.
It's comfortable.
Hey, thank you.
Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
no, yeah. Board mission. One. And you're like, oh my God, what did I just?
And then, to be fair, if you'd like to call us back to order, I will give some notes about the binder and the card. Okay. Sure.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay. This is Urban Renewal Agency. It's Wednesday, January 5th, 2022, and it's 5:44 p.m. On the agenda is roll call. I'll start with myself and we'll introduce each other as we go around the table. I'm Doug Morton, the chairman, and to my left.
Jessica Chilton, Councilwoman.
Agency Administrator John Walsh.
Counselor Patrick Berkeley.
Mayor Schultz.
Councilor Steve Topaz. Thank you. And next item on the agenda is consent agenda for approval. Draft minutes dated May 5th, 2021. Everyone had an opportunity to read those or not read those. None. I'm entertaining a motion.
Motion to accept minutes as indicated.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded that we accept the minutes of May 5th, 2021. All in favor signify by raising your hand. It's unanimous. We have 5 votes, including myself, to none. Now we're down on the agenda item, public comment. Anyone in the room for have any comments? In the room. Now we are down to the discussion action items.
Public comment on Zoom.
Oh, public comment, I'm sorry. Oh, Zoom? We're okay, thank you. Discussion / action items. Presentation of URA basics and transportation plans overview. Rachel, are you,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chair Morton.
could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Rachel Barry and I am the government affairs person here at the city of St. Helens. Hello to the millions watching online. So the purpose of this presentation, this is an educational overview. Several of the cities adopted transportation plans and also the Urban Renewal Agency plan, as well as we're also going to cover some basics of tax increment financing and urban renewal. Also going to touch a little bit on how cities and municipalities fund transportation projects. Purpose of this presentation, this is not to critique and go into already adopted plans. This is really about the connections between those transportation plans and urban renewal. Jenny is going to give a little bit more orientation as to what is in your binder and how to best use these binders for your information as we go through the presentation. Please note there are slide numbers throughout the presentation in the top right corner. Quite a lot of material to cover. So we are going to ask that you hold questions until the end, but make a note of that slide number that's related to a particular slide. There's quite a bit to get through, and right now I'm going to hand it over to Jacob to start talking about giving a history of some of our city transportation plans. What?
I think I rehearsed this yesterday a little bit. I was kind of introductory role as well, but I wanted to bring it up because Jake.
Insulted.
There's quite a lot of information to cover.
Stick to the plan.
This is what happens when I get a script.
So rehearsal.
I have to share Jacob's point, because Jacob's said, after we going through this a lot of information in a short amount of time, and he says, this is like a dinner. And I'm thinking, this is like a dinner. Is it dinner because why? Because it takes a long time to put together and it's over quick, or is it because we're gonna feel really full, or is it why is it like a dinner? But what we've done here is to bring, you asked for this presentation, and you want to learn more about urban renewal, and we're happy you have done that. And we brought together, I would call the A team, in this case, maybe the U team.
Mine is over.
But, yeah, so we're gonna go through a lot of information, and then there's probably questions, and if,
How was it like a dinner? Catch that part.
So what I would recommend is also jotting down these cards if you do have questions, in case you don't get to the question, because there's gonna be a lot of information in a quick amount of time, that you can go to Jenny and Jacob and Rachel and Mohammed or John, and they're gonna be able to answer these questions and point you and let you know, if you have. I just wanted to throw that out there too, because there is a lot of information. It was very extensive in the process. That started with Mayor Peterson, and I was able to adopt this through the city, but it was very extensive. And Lorelei, who is the principal broker of ECO now, was the presenter, and she's the president now, and that's how good she was able to discuss this, and it was still lengthy. That's all I had. That little bit.
Rachel's our facilitator.
We'll get underway, and I will use that privilege if necessary, if we're getting off track or if we just need to get back to topic. But right now, I will throw to Jacob, who is ready. Let's learn about transportation.
So my role in this presentation is to be the historian and talk about the work of tailors stitching things together. Focus on transportation planning as it relates to urban renewal. So the first slide here is our current urban renewal district. And this district aligns with the three commercial areas that we have in town, US 30, Holton, and the Riverfront area. And something I want to note is what we call the business loop in town, US 30, St. Helens, Columbia Boulevard, down to First, and then Old Holton Road to Gable. So that's the business loop as kind of our first anchoring of what we're going to talk about. So the next slide, please. So transportation planning has been going on for a long time. And you look around, you've been here a while, you find some old things like this plan from 1959. And really, this is just for historic interest and to show you that transportation planning has been going a long time and things change. Some interesting things on here. Notice, so this is a volume map. And look how much volume is here on Columbia Boulevard versus Gable. Gable is less than, and even Columbia Boulevard is more than the highway at this time, back when we were about a third of the population we're at today. But there's one thing that is still evident, and that is this business loop. We're going to talk about this business loop several times here. So not really related to urban renewal, but of transportation planning history interest at the very least. And I'm not going to get into specific projects that much, but I'm going to touch upon interchanges and overpasses a little bit because it's kind of a side question that has come up. And one of the earliest things we're able to find was just this concept back from 1968. In this one, we're on the north side by Pittsburgh Road. Not terribly realistic because of topography. But one thing to note is look how much area this takes up. An interchange, that takes a lot of planning to figure out how you're going to figure out making it happen. So enough for the history lesson. Let's get into a little more modern time into the 90s. 1997. So 1997, this is an important year. And I really kind of consider it a beacon year if you're looking in your rearview mirror about, okay, when did some of this imagination about where our city should go start? And really, this 1990-2020 vision plan is a critical part of that. And if you look at some of these bullet points, all these things are very familiar, the things we've talked about quite a bit. But for the purpose of this presentation, I just want to highlight number 4, where it talks about people being guided to the Riverfront District and Holton areas, gateway parks, tree-lined boulevards, urban design amenities, very familiar stuff. One thing I want to mention, just especially for some of you newer folks, is this resolution here. This is back from 2014. And you notice how I have these in brackets. Back in 97, it was called Old Town or Oldie Towny. And the council adopted a resolution in 2014 that said we are prohibited from using those terms. We must use the term Riverfront District. That's just one of those interesting things that happens. So another thing that happened in 1997 is the city adopted its first transportation systems plan. And there's some intersections which we'll pick on in later plans. And notice that there's really not an emphasis on Plymouth at this time. We still have the business loop that's evident. And this is the first time an overpass, at least as far as I know, has been mentioned in one of our formally adopted plans. In this case, it was an interchange along the Pittsburgh Road area for an estimated cost at that time of about $500,000. So that was the 1997 transportation system.
Jacob, that's almost $5 million, isn't it?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, at that time.
I subtracted a 0.
I was like, why didn't they build it? That's what I was thinking.
So fast forward a little bit to 2005 strategic plan. Now the strategic plan was all encompassing, not just transportation or capital improvements. But there are some things that were observed in there. So you have that vision plan, right? It talks about gateways and corridors and we're continuing to stitch things together. I talked about, the tailor stitching things together. And so, okay, well, we still want to keep talking about gateways and we only want to give some emphasis on US 30 and Holton. So, okay, great. So those are some things that we need to think about into the future. And 2 years after that, in 2007, next slide, please, the economic development plan. And now we're talking about master plans for along the highway, Holton, and Riverfront District. So now we're including all 3 of those commercial areas that I talked about in the first slide. And the vision plan talked about gateways. And then we're starting to see some of those concepts in our planning documents to help us visualize how the city can look in a more prosperous future. 2009, now this is a rail study for both Columbia and Clatsop County, kind of similar to what the port is undergoing currently. And the reason I bring this up is this overpass discussion was mentioned. However, at this time, the discussion was specific to pedestrian and bicyclists with the guess that, well, it may be impractical. And so, that number is starting to increase.
Yeah.
We're a little over 6 million now. Next slide, please. So back to the city-specific adopted plans, 2007. So here, or excuse me, 2011, this is the city's second transportation systems plan. And here's that business loop. We're always going back to that business loop. If we go to the next slide, look at some other things from that plan. So now the plan is starting to emphasize this Plymouth connection, which we are very familiar with now. Some more of these intersections that we're picking on today are included in there. And this is the 3rd time in our adopted documents that we have an overpass mentioned. Now, we're at 15 million, so substantially greater. And at this time, they were talking about putting it on the south end, because that's where the higher volume of traffic would be. The traffic consultants at the time thought that made more sense. That was to be at Millard Road. Of course, that ship has sailed, given the efforts that of the construction there on at Millard and US 30. Interestingly, our transportation systems plan had a traffic signal and reconfiguration for 1 million. And I'm not misreading it. But it's funny that that was so grossly understated. This plan is famous for underguessing project costs, unfortunately. But nothing's perfect. One thing though I want to talk about is how do we pay for things? And there's a variety of mechanisms like urban renewal that'll be discussed later, but there's also system development charges. And I only bring up system development charges because we considered this project in that. And Doug will probably remember this. For many years, there was a reduced rate on system development charges, and we're trying to figure out the numbers so that they made sense. And when we were working on those calculations, this project just kicked those fees way up. It's like, this isn't going to work. This is not, the contractor's going to come complain. And so the thought was, okay, well, this is probably not within the 20-year planning horizon. So if we remove that from the SDC calculations, we'll have a more reasonable number. And that's what we did. And we still think we were right in that it wasn't part of the 20-year plan. But some of these big projects can impact other things. One more slide about this transportation systems plan. So I mentioned stitching. We're stitching those old plans. And we were thinking, okay, well, we're making this blanket. We got to continue make it, right? So we were thinking ahead, and we specifically put this in this plan. And basically, this is the foundation of the corridor plan, which we'll talk about soon, and later plans. Well, we need some ammo to help get us grants for this future planning. And so that's what we're doing here, continuing to stitch and make connections. So that brings us to the corridor plan, which we adopted in 2015. So a transportation systems plan is more broad. You're looking at the whole city. These corridor plans are kind of considered refinement plans when you're looking at specific areas in more detail. In this case, we're looking at two of our commercial areas along the highway, and then the Columbia Boulevard, St. Helens Street couplet for Holton. When we originally applied for this, we were considering the entire business loop, but the state came back and said that's probably too much. In retrospect, yeah, it probably was. So we just had those two legs there. If we go to the next slide, just to explain refinement plans a little bit more, we get into details about state standards based on unique circumstances like extra wide rights of way, topography, things like that. Some of our urban design amenities like these bump outs, as well as problem intersections like this one by Chamber of Commerce. Another thing that this plan considered, if we go to the next slide, gateways. We talked about gateways, and here's this concept again by the Chamber of Commerce building here. And we actually applied for a grant several years ago to get it. I can't remember which one it was now, but that didn't work out. So we're continuing to stitch. We're continuing to weave that blanket. And 2016, so now we're talking about the old veneer riverfront property. And one of the things that we did with this effort is we started thinking about other problem intersections. Okay, well, we're going to make this connection. We're going to have more traffic. We have some intersections that are kind of funky now, but lower volumes. What's going to happen to those when there's larger volumes? And so, well, we want to try to start thinking of how we're going to solve those problems. So if we go to the next slide, back in 2016, we had these sketches where we're starting to think, okay, how do we do this? And these were all preliminary ideas, but we're like, oh man, we really gotta figure this out. So that brings us to 2019, Riverfront Connector. And this is very recent, and hopefully you all are familiar with this one since it's not that old. And if we go to the next slide. So before I had mentioned the corridor plan, we had US 30, the Columbia Boulevard, Holton area. Now we're completing that business loop. And it's a good thing that we waited on this because we were able to figure out more for this property and have a little bit more insight in what we wanted to look at. So all these problem intersections, things like that. If we go to the next slide, here's an example of dealing with one of our unique streets, Plymouth Street, and how we want to handle that. And then on the next slide, we'll see how we kind of revised from those sketches from 2016 to more refined planning concepts for some of these problem intersections, such as the one at Castor, where we're talking about putting the face safety facility there. Now, the final slide for me is just looking at all together. So this is the blanket that I'm talking about, where we stitch together. 1997, 2020 vision. It's 2022, not too far off. And then these plans that we've considered since then. So there's this continuing evolution. And then what happens here? 2017. Now we have a revenue source, as John mentioned at the previous meeting. We had 20 years, 1997, 2017, 20 years of effort that resulted in fueling urban renewal. And then, we kept on planning with the Riverfront Connector there. So it's a funding all these dreams that we have. And that's a good place for me to transition into John, I believe.
I'm not gonna make a dinner meal out of that one.
Making blankets, we're making dinner. Here we go.
All right, so I'm gonna go through the urban renewal basics, what it is, how urban renewal works. The lifespan of an agency, your agency directors and chairs and vice chairs here, and it's a separate form of its own governmental unit, has its own decision making and reporting and the things, adopting its own budget, those types of things. Yeah, and then grab a slide there, I think. So essentially how the point I want to make with this slide is that there are a number of agencies around the state of Oregon and really up and down the coast and across the country that have some form of urban renewal. And an urban renewal is essentially a tax increment financing district. In California, they're known as redevelopment agencies and tax increment districts. There's different names for them, but they all essentially are a concept where they're taking a portion of the tax base and the local government is steering that towards an agency which is directed to make investments and try to accelerate and get blighted properties back on the tax rolls and be productive. And so if we back up to that slide just a little bit more, I wanted to kind of really highlight some of our peer cities that we've been modeling and how they've used urban renewal to kind of accelerate their waterfronts, to do just general revitalization of their communities. And you look at, the big dot is agency of River. You look at Astoria, they both had really fabulous success with their investments. Independence down where in the pop out there is part of their success in activating their waterfront, and just move on down the coast. You'll just see a lot of agencies that have used this as a tool. And I say it's a tool, and it's a part of it. It's not the answer to funding everything, all projects. So it's a contributing revenue source that helps to leverage grants, and work with local resources to complete projects. And now we can move to the next one. Again, it's pretty ubiquitous. There's some criticism on how it's used. And the criticism comes when the money is not used to make public investments. We talked about investing that in a public safety facility. That does, indirectly, yes, there's probably an argument that a portion that could be used to do facilitate economic development at some level. But then if we're gonna do that, then we have to do this analysis of, you know, does it benefit the district or the city? And heavily has should be benefiting the district, so it'd be a contributing portion of contribution. You see some cities will buy fire trucks and different kinds of things, but our promise throughout this growth with the people, the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are our other taxing jurisdictions within the county, was that we're going to attempt to make investments that put tax, get free tax growth. And
John, can I just to add to that, you're right. You didn't explain that very good earlier about the tax, how we get that tax increment 100% from the future growth from the county, the fire department, all those taxing districts.
it's
So just now, just vaguely, but that was a huge part of our process of going through this. Right.
Yeah,
I just wanted to
okay.
clarify a little bit on that, because how it generates revenue.
We're gonna get there.
Comment card.
Very next slide, I think.
Is it really?
Very close.
So in order for
I'm gonna shut up.
part of this creating urban renewal plan is to define an area. We're creating a boundary, and that boundary has a specific limitation on size, and it has to be contiguous, and then things of that nature. And then it also has to be defining blight. You know, what is blight? You know, blight has different things in your mind, but it's sometimes not as it's underdeveloped property. It's underutilized property. This property that's just underperforming, and a little bit of investment would get it to a different place. You know, obviously that, you know, abandoned buildings and, you know, things of that nature too are kind of our go-to places with blight. But and you know, blight is also properties without infrastructure that need infrastructure in order to create that investment. So, and such as the riverfront. So, urban renewal agencies they're limited by time and by maximum indebtedness, and the driving factor is a term called maximum indebtedness, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. But there's also a time imposition where you can either establish so many years or a maximum amount of debt the agency can go into, and there's a difference between the debt of an agency versus the capital projects. Because you look at our plan, you'll see $42 million in projects, but we can go through $62 million in debt, and that has to do with, you know, it's the way urban renewal works is that much like the Special Public Works Opportunity Fund, we're taking out a loan. Sorry, I'm not making eye contact. That's vertically. And it's about servicing debt. You know, we make these the motivation of the district is to get those investments as soon as we can make them, and get that money, you know, invested and working, and then servicing a debt stream to get those investments paid off. So that public investment follows by the private investment, which has tax base, and that comes on the tax rolls and just kind of, you know, grows almost exponentially. And so we have a $42 million project list, $62 million maximum indebtedness. We set the agency up initially so that when we get to that 62 million, it's done, which shuts down all that. There's some graphs that show this more clearly in a bit here, but basically the agency's over, it disbands, it's done its job, and we can move on.
About funds. $16 million tomorrow won't be worth what $16 million is today. Is there any kind of table that deals with the value of money as time goes on?
So
is that $16 million? That's it?
No, that's
Or $16 million when we start? What does that equate to when it finishes?
yeah.
Count for inflation.
Exactly.
There's that is definitely a factor. That dollar today is not worth as much as $1 tomorrow, and the projects assume some of that. But again, these aren't 100% of the contributing piece of that isn't 100% either. So,
I don't want to disrupt anything.
but yes, 62 million gets less valuable every year.
Okay.
And,
That is a.
Can the agency invest it in bonds before it uses it?
I do not believe that would be appropriate use of funds because that doesn't get tax growth. It's supposed to be making investments to.
Please tell me, but I'm gonna make a $62 million investment in 5 years. And I've got $40 million now, which I'm not gonna spend. But it's been earmarked, but it's gotta be spent basically now.
We can park on that one.
Yeah, I've got a note on that. Let's check on it.
Easy question, but so this graph, I like this graph. It shows how urban renewal works in concept, and then we'll do another graph that shows the high, medium, lows, some scenarios. And so in 2017, we created this urban renewal district, and we defined the boundary and we froze the tax base, and that's some odd term for some people to hear it. And it freezes the tax base on what level of taxes goes to our partner taxing agencies. So the county is going to get in 2017 what it's going to get until we reach that threshold. And the mosquito vector control and the fire district and all the other partnering districts are frozen there. And the increment above that is the revenue that the city is collecting to reinvest in the community and accelerate development and get it to a place where it expires. And so that's the concept. So we're freezing it. The tax is actually parsed. You'll see an extra line on your tax bill. That's not an increase in taxes. You'll just see the agency and you'll see that the increment that going to the agency. And it's not just, and that was an aha moment for me when I first learned this years ago. It's not just the city's taxes. If they go to this district, it's we collect all of the fire districts increment above and all of our taxing partners. So all these public entities are pooling their money to give to the city to reinvest in projects that are going to hopefully benefit the longer term.
And within that geography.
How did it say?
And during the process,
You're probably gonna get to that, sorry.
well, during the creation of the plan, that they did. There's a requirement, and even through the amendment, there's requirements that we engage with the stakeholder agencies, and that was really one of the biggest things we did successful with the creation of this plan, is having the backing of all the projects that Jacob talked about, and nobody could deny that this was a fantastic thing we're doing here. And a lot of agencies start off and they just have a dream and we're going to create a plan, and they don't really have any projects lists, and we just want to do it. And those don't do as well as fire districts and other, people that you're taking their current operating revenue from are come out hard against it. And we got, in fact, in 2008, it was that way. It was pretty, it was a pretty strong opposition to the plan.
So you showed them the list, they said, yes, this is a
We
good list.
engaged them, consulted with them,
Got it.
everybody got a consultation, and unanimous approval. It was really, I feel good. So, I think next slide. So we talked about this. It's typically it's 25, 30 years. If we need it, and we may, but if our projections track with our adjustment, we're going to be pretty close to hitting it where we initially planned to. That Armstrong kind of saw how the passive money grew, but you go back a few years of Armstrong leaving and then going down and nothing happening, and it just delayed the agency's ability to collect revenue. And I talked about what happens when it's done. It goes that everybody's comes back on our taxi partners are made whole, or they're making a much higher revenue. And so Rachel's.
It's right back on me.
Yeah,
Rehearsal. No, that's great. So this is the moment where I kind of transitioned to just looking at your binders really quickly. I thought this was a good idea to summarize all of the urban renewal paperwork into a clean binder for all of our agency members. And this slide is just my trigger to tell you what's in it. So the first item in it is the adopted amended urban renewal plan. And then the next sticky is the report. So the urban renewal plan is composed of two items, the plan and then the report. And so they're both part of the adopted agency. And then the third item is the report on the amendment. So we did a major amendment in 2020, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So that's the report on that. And then the last item is what's shown on the slide here. So you scroll down a little bit just to see the bottom of it. This is the title page of a handbook that the Oregon Economic Development Agency group creates and updated in 2019, and it's best practices for how to create and manage urban renewal agency areas. So if you go to the next slide. This is the table of contents. I just put this in here because I wanted to show you that chapters 1 through 5 are all about forming the plan, which we've already done. So I'd recommend just reading through chapter 6 in your spare time, which is just about managing a district or an agency. If, as John mentions, is tax increment financing, it's the finance tool of urban renewal. So you'll hear those terms kind of interchangeably. I also recommend, if you're curious more about how the projects list was generated, section 4.4 talks about the different calculus that's used when determining whether or not a project is worthwhile to include in an urban renewal agency. Notably, the mayor likes to talk about return on investment.
Yep.
And this section 4.4 talks about that.
The waterfront's the biggest.
You want to have a high return on investment within the projects that you spend money on within the agency because of our promise to those taxing districts. So that handbook is going to be a resource for you all as agency members, and I just recommend reading through it. And if you have questions, talk to John, talk to me, talk to Matt if it's about the finance budgeting sections. Go to the next slide.
Quick question, return on investment, is there a time due on that?
So the handbook's just talking in general.
Okay.
Yeah. So now I want to get into the specifics. We've all been talking about urban renewal in general. John sort of got into some specifics about the adoption. I'm going to get into it a little bit more. So if you go to the next slide. So this was when we were in the process of adopting our original plan. So it started in 2016 and was finally adopted in the summer of 2017. And we had 3 advisory committee meetings through that year-long process. And page 2 in your binder shows the members of that advisory committee, and they were members of the Port, Columbia County, CRFR, C911, the school district, stop goals involved. And so there was a wide spectrum of people involved in this plan's creation. And it's also a requirement for state statutes that they all are part of this process. And so that's the purpose of this slide. And as John mentioned, we had unanimous support for adoption at those public meetings or those public hearings at the Planning Commission and Council. So this slide talks about the overall goals. Rachel loves to talk about goals and strategic planning, and I just think it's really important to have this framework. And so I just kind of put this in here. So the purpose of urban renewal is to assist with the implementation of adopted plans, policies, and codes. So we're really relying on that 10 years of work that we went through. This is the implementation tool. Back up one slide, sorry. So the first goal of urban renewal is just about public stakeholder involvement. The last 4 focus on infrastructure, public amenities to support new development, safety and capacity of existing transportation corridors, improving public access to the Columbia River through investments in waterfront, open space, and paths, and revitalization of the Holton and downtown business districts. These are huge goals. It's what you work on every day. And so I feel like this really encapsulates urban renewal for the city. Next slide. So these are the different buckets, and they correspond to our goals. So there's transportation infrastructure, there's open space and wayfinding, there's site preparation and utilities to get those blighted properties back online. And lastly, there's the economic development programs bucket. And there's 2 things I want to point out here. So the category for open space and wayfinding, you'll see kind of odd terminology in here like trestle trail, greenway, things that we now would term the Riverwalk Project. And the reason that term isn't used in the projects list is because we coined that project's name in 2020, not in 2017 when we adopted this. So another area where it's kind of a little odd is we don't have the name St. Helens Industrial Business Park in the urban renewal plan, and that's because that was a coined term later on. But we do have site preparation and utility planning and construction for industrial sites, so we know what that means. So as you read through the projects list, there may be some of that, like, is this talking about the Riverwalk? So I just wanted to point that out. And next slide. So this is how the projects break down into those buckets. So 50% of urban renewal is spent on infrastructure. 24% is spent on open space, site preparation is 15%. And so, obviously open space also has infrastructure within it. It also includes the Riverwalk project. So these can be a little bit misleading and there's some gray area, but the point of this slide is just to say, we are investing in projects that are going to create private investment within the agency area. And that's evidenced by our project categories here. And John sort of talked about why the projects total around 42 million, and that's because urban renewal utilizes debt service, we take on loans, we have interest, and so the maximum indebtedness is 62, while our projects list is 42. So running through some of the different projects that urban renewal can fund, a lot of this should be repeat. John kind of did a good overview of it before, but we've obligated our urban renewal funds on the debt service for this project. This is the street extension project onto the veneer site. So in a way, urban renewal is funding this project. And so I just wanted to include that as a slide. We know this is the highest priority right now for the urban renewal agency. Next slide. Another high priority, the Riverwalk project. We've also, within our loan, through the Special Public Works Opportunity Fund that John mentioned, are going to pay for portions of the Riverwalk. And so, this is an eligible expense within the urban renewal agency area. Urban renewal can also fund parking management strategies. So we know over time, we may need to do a study downtown as it becomes more attractive to come down here. We can fund parking structures using urban renewal, not entirely, but portions of the project costs. We can also do additional master planning. So we know there's still going to be some site planning on the industrial business park. So urban renewal can help fund that. Next slide. Storefront improvements. The mayor loves to talk about this. So this is an example in Astoria where the private property owners invest in their storefront and urban renewal provides a percentage of that. And that triggers more additional private investment, which is just the example of how urban renewal should work. It's a great example of that. Next slide. St. Helens Industrial Business Park. We can fund site readiness, utilities. Fortunately, we're able to use some of our ARPA funds on this, but urban renewal can fund additional phase work on this site. So you'll see on pages 7, 8, and 9 in your binders of the plan, there's a complete projects list. This is just a crash course and highlighting some of the heavy hitters right now. This projects list is color coded per project category. And each project has a relation to those urban renewal goals, which I think is great. And then it also has a total estimated area contribution. The term contribution is important. We keep hitting this, that urban renewal is not intended to be the sole source of funding. We're supposed to match it with other things when we can. And Mohammed later is going to talk about other sources of funding. Next slide. So 2020, we did a couple of things and I want to talk about those. We updated our revenue forecasts and we also did a major amendment. I think all of you were around when we did that, but this is just a good overview. There are some people in Zoom world watching this and probably on YouTube. So let's just quickly. So as John mentioned, so the y-axis on this is the assessed value of our agency. And in 2019, you see there's a big dip. So our projected value kept going up, but in 2019 it went down. Well, we know this is because Armstrong left. And not only that, but they didn't have their planned investment in the site didn't occur. So it was kind of a double hit, double whammy for our agency area. So what did we do? Next slide. We did an updated forecast. We needed to know for planning purposes, is this just a small blip? Are we like totally wildly outdated in our revenue projections? And when we updated our assessed value forecasts, it was good news. So it is just a small blip. If you see that small green section on this chart, Armstrong's leaving is just a small downward trend, but we are seeing an increase over time. And this is because we're seeing development within the agency area of the St. Helens Place apartments, of Grocery Outlet, Greystone Estates. So all of these things are having a positive impact on our revenue projections. And then if you note, so the original forecast is in orange, and then there's 3 blue lines. I think it's blue. So there's kind of a high, medium, and low projected forecast here. And for planning purposes, we look at the low projections because we don't want to assume the economy is going to be great forever. We want to be modest in our assumptions. So here's that table just showing TIF revenue as opposed to assessed value. So again, if you look at 2022 and look up, we're right at where we thought we would be originally, just due to the investment in the agency area. So we're doing very well. Which is a very different story than in 2017. And if you follow that line up, follow the low projection, it's not quite as high as our original forecast, and that's okay. It just means that the agency will last longer to reach the maximum indebtedness. It doesn't, we still have that same cap for our agency. Ideally, we would reach the original forecast and, get to our maximum indebtedness quicker, and maybe we will. So I have even more good news. So those projections were done prior to our amendment. So if you remember, in 2020, we decided to remove some underperforming properties and some properties that were tax exempt, like the Gable Road apartments that Matt is hovering over now. And we added properties that we thought were likely to get developed, like the McNulty Industrial Park and Greystone Estates at the north side. And so we made some assumptions about Greystone because we knew it was underway, and highlighted in that section there, it talks about that amendment having a potential impact of 2.8 million in TIF revenue. So over the life of the agency. And so that's just going to get us closer to that original forecast faster, and we'll get to our maximum indebtedness at a more reasonable time frame than we initially anticipated by doing this boundary amendment. So it's good news. So with that, we've mentioned this throughout the presentation that urban renewal is not the sole source of funding. And so we wanted to bring Mohammed in and talk about other transportation funding options.
Thank you, Jenny. Great presentation. The team have put all this information. You've seen the contrast between the past, present, and the future. And transportation funding traditionally are an expensive investment. You've seen the 5 millions when we started in 97.
Yeah.
Today, multiply that by 3% inflation over the years. The cost to build that same exact projects can triple over time, right? How do we make all this happen? How do we bring this to life? Number one, we have to thank our A team here, as John mentioned. Leadership and staff work really hard towards this. And what differentiate projects like that from an idea or conceptual to life is a driver. Management, leadership, all together to work to bring it to life. And we are in a golden opportunity. I can say I'm very proud to be part of this entire team, and we're going to keep pushing until we change the city and take it into the future. So as I mentioned, traditionally transportation funding is very expensive. So the Urban Renewal Agency is one piece of the puzzle, right? This is not going to fund, obviously, all this great projects you've seen. What do we do to get funding? Council Topaz, you brought up a really good idea not too long ago about looking at partnerships, right? We have to start looking at private partnership. We're talking about development, private development, public service combined together and build that partnership with these folks who have expertise, who have resources, who have the means to come and help cities and municipalities like us and get those funding towards these projects. And this is the traditional way municipality relied heavily on either its taxes or these small investment, but we're really kind of start looking outside of that framework and think outside the box to be able to get and generate funding options for these projects. So our goal is to really focus on building that partnership with the developers, the private sector that we're working with, again, bring all these talents into one area and focus on bringing these resources to help us fund a lot of these projects. Great examples, the First Street extension projects we talked about. It's gonna combine between hopefully bringing developers that can help us build some of these routes and this structures. And last but not least, there's a lot of funding opportunities with state and federal grants. I think we can work harder towards those. There is always funding grants that come through Washington DC, Congress infrastructure packages, and those requires a lot of basically going in and putting for grants, small or big. We have to really tackle those areas really closely in order to get more funding for our transportation plan and what we're trying to achieve. With that said, last but not least, we have one more slide for you. So thank you for being patient. Rachel, run with it and close that.
Well, and it all comes back to mission, right? This is about service to our community. This is built on 20 years of planning. And all of these projects being planned out, being connected, but also let's keep in mind that it's about ensuring stakeholders are involved, right? And it's about investing in the infrastructure and public amenities to keep the engine going, to draw private investment and continue generating revenue. This is also about access to the river. It's about realizing community dreams. And here is the opportunity, right? It may take another 20 years, but we're on the way. And really the revitalization within the district is a very big part of this. All of these braid together to generate additional revenue and keep the agency moving forward. Are there questions? Yeah, from the millions watching at home.
Have we a projection of what would be the best industries to bring in the most money? Dollars per square foot, and what would fit here?
I am so happy to ask our economists partners from the state of Oregon to give us a breakdown. A lot of the market research recently has focused on light industrial and manufacturing, but
Light industrial doesn't need a river though.
no, and the question is like specific industries to target for
Yes.
potential investment?
Okay.
I would just like to see if there's anybody on Zoom who'd like to ask a question. There is it? Okay, so my one, not question, but what I know, we'll go out for RFQ for the development. Potentially, those could be investors that also are the people that are qualified to do the development. I know that in Forest Grove, Coos Bay, particularly, I was just down there for the mayors, and North Bend, they both have urban renewals. It seems like there's a very collaborative between the investors and I know Forest Grove's project for sure was only sold for $250,000 because they proposed a nice, beautiful building the property was worth more.
Lawrence as well.
So, but it was the return on the investment that sold, and same with, of course, Independence, what we're, who we modeled a lot of ours after because it's similar. It's similar to our waterfront.
Yeah, and this is about, as we're seeking that private partner, kind of like how we target it is, could you rephrase your question or? Yes, I think we do need to keep.
Well, Mohammed spoke of doing public-private partnership and how you get there. And the development of the roads could actually be done in lieu of price of properties too, which is a win-win. I suspect. Am I correct in assuming that's how other renewals have utilized those tools?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, that's a good example. I mean, even working in different industries with other government agencies, that's a lot of it where developers come in and, they get work a deal with the city or the municipality over a property, they build it at no cost for the city, and then they lease it for 50 years or vice versa. So there's a lot of with that when you have a developer. And the potential pretty much is limitless. We have the land now, we have the plans, we have all the vision. We're gonna execute and we will find the right partner.
Because the waterfront is the biggest, and I get that, I mean, the biggest in increments, tax increments, we're gonna fulfill that maximum indebtedness. That's where the value's at.
Rachel, would you like to entertain any questions at this point?
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. So is there an ability to update the list? With the names not being changed, I'm assuming that it's not easy to update the list.
Hey, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, actually, we looked at this right before the meeting. So amending the projects list does require an amendment. So you have to go through a similar process that we went through with the boundary amendment. So all the taxing districts have to, you know, agree that it's an amended, it's a project we're amending for. There's a balance in specificity
Yeah.
and, you know, opposite of specificity, vagueness, so that you have flexibility to spend agency funds on things. So if you look at the projects list, we're not being specific about parcel A, B, at this like this much. So there is some flexibility within the projects list. So if you have something in mind, I would just chat with staff to see how that fits in. Yeah.
Other questions? And as there are questions, as you do read through the binder and get more familiar with our plan and how that works, like please ask questions. Always happy to go on. Yes, as you read through the binder and become familiar, staff's always happy to answer questions.
I think to Jessica's question, it was kind of highlighted that there were certain dollar amounts presented to the taxing districts. It was in 3 different sections. And certain dollar amounts for each section, and because
So it was very general when it was presented to them.
yeah, we wanted to make sure that we were gonna get some type of urban renewal agency passed, particularly for the waterfront. That was number 1, okay, and everybody knew why they were there. But they liked all the connector plans like Jacob talked about. And they were all like, we want it all. It was like, okay, you got option A, which is this, option B, which is this in the gateway, or option A, B, and C, which goes out to the highway and kind of almost back around. There's a little tiny gap in Old Portland. That's not there in the railroad tracks. So other than that, it's a full loop. So any of the properties off of that new buildings are built, we get 100% of the tax, and any improvements onto existing buildings with storefront restoration, that we get that increment in tax increase, the whole 100% of that. So it's not a tax increase. It was a big misconception when it was first getting, that people thought we were raising taxes. It does not. The county sets the tax rate. So that's something you could, if anybody asks you, say no. It's county assessed to value. That's all we're going off of. We don't raise taxes. The city does not raise taxes.
Any other questions or comments? We've got 9 minutes.
I think that's
before
a,
we adjourn.
You were on it, Doug.
Well,
we have one order of business too, as far as chair and vice chair. So
for me,
the order of
Oh, and the adoption of the budget.
adoption, but there's a couple action items here. I was just gonna second with the point that the mayor was making as far as the initial engagement with the taxing agencies, is that we did provide a couple different scenarios of high, medium, low, and everybody was, you know, we believe in the dream, let's do it, kind of thing. And so.
we finished?
Yeah.
Okay, what we have now is our agent administrator report. And are you at all? Yes.
One item.
Resolution for the budget.
Okay. Okay, we're on item 3. I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. Under discussion and action item, resolution number UR -07, adopting 2022 2023 and 2023-2024 budget.
I'll make a motion to adopt resolution number UR-07, adopting the 2022, 2024 budget.
Second.
Where did you come up with seven?
It's been moved and seconded that we are here. Okay. It's been moved and seconded that we adopt resolution number UR-07, adopting the 2022, 2023, and 2023-2024 budget.
Moved.
Any discussion? It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. I'll call for the vote and we'll do roll call. Hilton?
Aye.
Counselor Berkeley?
Aye.
Mayor Shaw?
Yep.
Counselor Topaz? And Counselor Morton, yay. Unanimous, 5-0. So we have adopted resolution number UR-07. Now we'll move on to administrator report.
I'll make this really brief. Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you, staff, for this fantastic presentation. Putting this together and moving forward with it. Hopefully, this is recorded and gets looked at by people in the future that need to learn more about it. So I think we've done a pretty comprehensive look at it. The year ahead, and that's the agency's on track for doing great things, and so.
But this was a very informative meeting for appreciate all the staff in it. I'm very impressed with all of
I
it.
appreciate this right here. That's cool. That was very heads up right there.
Marshall has another 3-ring binder, only this is a very big one. Put in his collection in his bookshelf for sure.
You have a question?
Before we adjourn, before you adjourn, we still have.
Oh, yeah.
Chair and vice chair.
Next year, we are for the following 2 years, I believe, or is it 1 year? 1 year term.
This is 1 year annual.
Okay, so we've got to elect a chair and a vice chair. Is there any recommendations from the board?
We discussed continuing the present officers.
Any other discussion, any other comments? Do I hear any motions?
Continue with the current chair and vice chair.
From Councilor Berkeley, he's got a motion on the table. Do I hear a
Is this
second?
biannual though?
Second, no, the budget is by Andrew.
Okay.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded that we keep the same chairman and vice chairman. That would be Chairman Martin and Vice Chairman Chilton. We'll take a roll call. Councilor Chilton.
Aye.
Councilor Berkeley.
Aye.
Mayor Shell. Councilor Topaz. Councilor Morton, yay. Unanimous. Congratulations.
Oh, you said 5 minutes. I'm freaking out, like wearing tables and stuff.
You get your coffee, you get your
This is very informative, though.
We've had a cold over the New Year's.
I know.
Yeah, I can
Wow.
The tax and then there's the actual stuff.
I don't think it's a big one.
Okay, I so move the meeting adjourned.
All right.
Well, the mask keeps everything in, which is supposed to.
It just kind of, yeah, it's all.
And so I got to have personal conversations with all the overlapping districts and they were really like all in on it and very supportive